Welcome to the Joe Ligato Show. I'm your host, Dr. Joe Ligato. Our segment today is on the wealth divide in America. We see in our first graph that CEO pay is up 997% since 1978. So when you compare this to the typical worker, which is only up 10.9%, you might be asking yourself, if that is because CEO productivity has gone up, but typical worker productivity has not. Well, maybe we think that explains the difference between these two numbers, these two wildly divergent numbers, since 1978. Well, no, we have a graph here talking about that as well. And so we see that the typical worker's productivity has gone up 108%, while typical workers' productivity has gone up 240%, while hourly compensation has only gone up 108%. And you see that right around 1973. So the 1970s, again, is when there's that decoupling between hourly compensation and productivity. So productivity has gone up massively, but since the 70s, compensation has not gone up at the same rate. You next may justify this difference by saying that CEOs are keeping prices of important goods low with their productivity, which benefits everyone. Well, we have a graph for that as well. And we see here that people in both parties, Democrats and Republicans, are very concerned about the cost of various food and consumer good products. So right here, 78% of Republicans concerned about food and consumer good products prices, and Democrats 66%. Housing, the majority are concerned about housing costs. You see that the things that the typical big government is interested in, such as the stability of banks and financial institutions and how the stock market is doing, the average person really doesn't care about that overly much, the average person from both of these political parties. So we see that that is not the case, that giving CEOs, giving wealthy corporations a ton of money is not leading to a version of trickle-down economics that would lead to reasonable housing prices and reasonable food prices. So let's see another graph here. So if workers can't eat, maybe at least they have a roof over their head. Well, let's see if that's the case. Actually, we see that in this graphic right here, there is a lack of shared prosperity when it comes to home ownership. So in terms of millennials, 35% of American millennials have a home, own a home, and 70%, literally double, of Chinese millennials own a home. So China is still a middle-income country, yet for some reason, America, which is a high-income country, one of the highest-income countries, excluding a few of those really small city-state countries that are like tax havens. But the United States is extremely wealthy on a per capita basis, and yet we can't have homes, and people are concerned about things like food prices in America. While places like China don't have as many problems. I saw other graphics showing things like China's overall home ownership, depending on how you look at it, could be somewhere around 90-95% for a lot of regions of the country as well. So they're improving at a rate that America, a capitalistic system, is not able to keep up with. So communism doing better than America in this instance. So now you might be asking, well, maybe Americans deserve this because that's what they have voted for. Well, the next few graphics will hopefully help you recognize the diluted nature of that line of thinking. We see here a graph based off of a study on average citizen preferences and how often that leads to policy changes versus the policy preferences of the economic elite and special interest group, lobbyist groups. And we see what we want is a slope for that line. We want it to be kind of tilted, right? And what we see here is even if on the x-axis, so horizontal, even if 100% of the average citizens want a policy change, the chance of that happening based off of the percent of people favoring it is essentially zero. Like there's no influence of the average citizen's preferences on whether a policy is changed or not. If 0% want the policy to be changed, it's about 0.3 probability of adoption of the new policy, and if 100% of the average citizens want something to be changed, it's still about a probability of 0.3 for the adoption of that policy change. So we have another graph from that study. And here's looking at the economic elite. And the economic elite, as you can see, if 0% want something, there's a 0% chance of, or 0% probability of adoption of that policy change. But if 100% of the economic elite want a policy to be adopted, a policy to be changed, we see that it's a probability of 0.6 for policy adoption. So the economic elite have a major role to play in terms of whether something is adopted or not. So maybe we could say the economic elite have a large degree of influence over America, but what about interest groups, lobbying types of groups? Well, it turns out that if the vast majority of lobbying groups support something, it has a 0.6 probability of adoption. And if they don't support something, it has a near zero probability of adoption here. So we see that the average citizen has nearly no influence over policy adoption, policy changes in America. And so I'm going to make this as clear up front. These graphs will also back me up on this, but Americans, we live in an oligarchy. That's why I left and moved to the Philippines. The rich have the ability to dictate policy, while the vast majority of Americans have absolutely no say over the direction of the country. The graph you see on your screen clearly shows this. Slope of the line is what matters here for whether a group is influential on getting a policy adopted, and the average person has nearly no ability to affect change. So we have to ask ourselves a few questions given these graphs. Because these graphs show us that what people believe and value doesn't really matter for influencing policy change. So we have to ask ourselves, do we really live in a democracy if that is the case? Do we even live in a republic if the represented officials don't enact the will of the people? Given the information we have, what descriptor is better for America other than an oligarchy? Can you think of one? I can't. And so our next graph shows that people aren't recognizing the problems in America. Democrats know that America unfairly favors powerful interest groups, but despite the fact that Republicans and Democrats are more polarized than ever, Republicans are also realizing the unfairness of the system. We see here that from April 2019 to April 2023, that the Republicans who think that the U.S. economic system unfairly favors powerful interests has gone from 52% to 68%. So in 4-ish years or so, it's gone up 16%. Democrats already knew that the system unfairly favors powerful interest groups, but Republicans are now coming on board, which, again, is extremely surprising during a time of such radical polarization. Republicans, Democrats can barely agree on anything, and yet they're agreeing that the U.S. economic system favors powerful interests over the average American. So the worst part of all of this is you may say that karma will get these people eventually, the powerful interest group that control America, or at least if they sink a nation, they will go down with the nation. Well, that is not the case. The psychopaths that are extracting all the resources, exploiting people, getting wealthy off of human suffering, those people, I would consider them psychopaths. And these psychopaths, they just flee from one country to another after the population gets fed up with being exploited. The powerful economic elites, the wealthy, the heads of these lobbyist groups, they're already building bunkers in places like New Zealand because of the self-sufficient nature of some of these areas in case they provoke a nuclear war. So while you will have to suffer the consequences of their actions, they never have to suffer the consequences of their actions. And so in summary for this segment, we highlighted the huge increase in CEO pay, 997%, compared to the typical worker pay, which is 10.9% since 1978. Despite worker productivity increasing massively. This is not due to CEOs keeping prices low for things like consumer and food goods, as shown by the graph of food and consumer good prices, as well as the lack of shared prosperity, which is also evident in the low home ownership rates for American millennials compared to China. America is an oligarchy where the rich dictate policy and public opinion has little impact. This is supported by a graph showing that the average citizen has almost no influence on policy adoption compared to interest groups and the economic elite. The powerful can also flee from a country after exploiting it. America has a major wealth divide that seems impossible to reverse. No one is offering a nonviolent solution to this problem. Increasingly, people are discussing national divorces and civil war. So the question I leave you with is, what solutions can you think of to resolve the wealth gap mentioned, when even if all the average citizens working together has no influence over policy change in America?